In this video, we will look at the causes and consequences of a current account deficit. Current account deficit. The current account balance is the sum of the balance of trade in goods, balance of trade in services, primary income, and secondary income. The sum of the balance on goods and the balance on services is also called the balance of trade in goods and services. Therefore, the current account balance can be restated as the sum of the balance of trade in goods and services, primary income and secondary income. Let us look at the meaning of current account deficit. A current account deficit occurs when the outflow of money exceeds the inflow of money from trade in goods, trade in services, primary and secondary income. This means that the current account balance is negative. The graph shows the current account balance and trade balance in least developed countries. The current account balances for 2020 and 2022 were minus $31.6 billion and minus $64.5 billion respectively. These balances were negative, meaning that payments exceed receipts in the current account. Similarly, the balances of trade in goods and services between the same period were minus $90.3 billion and minus $118.5 billion respectively. A negative balance of trade implies that the value of imports is more than the value of exports. What are the causes of current account deficit? Some of the causes of current account deficit are high importation and low exportation, high or overvalued exchange rate, demand for raw materials, low level of productivity, low quality products, and low national savings and investment. We will consider these factors in detail. The major cause of a current account deficit is high importation and low exportation. Trade balance is usually the largest part of the current account. The other components form a small fraction of the account. Therefore, there is always a little difference between the trade balance and the overall current account balance for most countries. This means that the difference between exports and imports, which is the trade balance, is a major factor causing deficit balance on the current account. If imports exceeds exports, money outflow from the economy will exceed the inflow, leading to a current account deficit. Most of the factors that cause current account deficit affect the trade balance, in that they may reduce export or increase imports. Therefore, the other factors we will be considering will influence importation and exportation. They are high or overvalued exchange rate, demand for raw materials, low level of productivity, low quality products, and low national savings and investment. Another cause of a current account deficit is high or overvalued exchange rate. Exchange rate is the value of a currency in terms of another. High or overvalued exchange rate means the price of a country's currency is high relative to another country's currency. If the exchange rate of a country's currency is high, the exports of that country will become more expensive, while its imports become cheaper. Consequently, exports will decrease while imports will increase, causing a current account deficit. Demand for raw materials. Increase in demand for raw materials would increase imports and cause a deficit on the current account if imports exceed exports. Demand for raw materials is high for an economy that is growing. A growing economy produces more goods and services. Consequently, massive outflow of money from an economy to pay for raw materials may result in a current account deficit. Low level of productivity is another cause of current account deficit. Low productivity in a country means that the economy is not getting maximum output from its resources. The reasons for low productivity in a country include inadequate infrastructure, poor technological development, poor educational system, poor healthcare system, etc. This is why there is a productivity gap between developed and developing countries. Low productivity means there will not be enough goods available for export. Rather, the economy may have to depend on importation to meet domestic demand. This will cause a current account deficit. Low-quality products reduce the competitiveness of a country's products in the international market. Consequently, demand for its products in foreign markets decreases. Less exports can cause a current account deficit. Low national savings and investment. Low savings experienced in low-income countries make it difficult to have sufficient funds for investment purposes. Investment means the purchase of capital goods, e.g., factories and equipment. Less investment leads to low economic output. As a result, there will not be enough goods available for exportation, which may cause a deficit on the current account. Next, we are going to examine the consequences of a current account deficit. A deficit on the current account may not necessarily be a bad thing. So, the consequences are positive and negative effects. Note that the cause of the deficit would determine whether it is a serious problem or not. If it is a serious problem, it would require government policies to correct it. Sometimes, the deficit is temporary and can be reversed automatically. For example, a deficit caused by the importation of raw materials is a temporary issue, because output and export will later increase. Also, if the deficit forms a small percentage of a country's GDP, it is not considered a serious problem. But the lack of competitiveness of a country's product, due to high inflation or low-quality products, is a serious problem requiring policies from the government. The graph shows the current account balance as a percentage of the GDP of the UK between 1955 and 2022. In many of those years, the current account balance was negative. But it would not be considered a serious problem in each year because it was only a small percentage of the GDP. For example, the deficit was 8.3% of the GDP in Q1 of 2022. It was 0.4% in Q4, 2022. A deficit on the current account implies that there is a net outflow of money from the country. The country may run into a serious problem if the deficit is large and persistent. It has to borrow money from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, or deplete its foreign reserve, unless it can attract a lot of funds from abroad. Increased borrowing would require repayment of the interest and principal, which makes less funds available for developmental purposes, such as on education, hospitals, and infrastructure. Depreciation is the fall in the value of a country's currency. When exportation reduces, there will be a fall in demand for the currency of a country. This will cause a fall in the value of the country's currency. This is good for a country because its exports now become cheaper due to the lower value of its currency. Exports increase, thereby reducing the deficit. Rising unemployment. When domestic firms make less money from exports, they may have to lay off some of their workers. The unemployed have a low standard of living because they have no income. The government's spending on unemployment benefits, as a result, will increase. Budget deficit occurs if the government's spending is more than its revenue. The government borrows whenever it has a budget deficit. Lower living standards. Less inflow of money into the economy causes lower living standards. Loss of jobs caused by the deficit makes it difficult for people to have access to essential goods and services.